England's history is not just a chronicle of kings and battles, it is the story of a land repeatedly reshaped by waves of migration, conquest, and cultural fusion. From its earliest settlers to the seismic shift of the Norman Conquest, England evolved through a series of dramatic transformations, each leaving an indelible mark on its language, laws, and identity. This first installment explores England's journey from a windswept corner of prehistoric Europe to a unified medieval kingdom, tracing the footsteps of Celts, Romans, Anglo-Saxons, and Vikings, all of whom played a role in forging the nation we recognize today. Long before England existed, the land was a vast, untamed wilderness connected to Europe by a now submerged land bridge known as Doggerland. As the last ice age retreated around 11,000 years ago, rising seas severed Britain from the continent, creating the island we know today. The first hunter-gatherers arrived in this new world, living off the land in small nomadic bands. By 4000 BC, a revolution swept across Europe, farming, transforming England's landscape. Forests were cleared, crops sown, and permanent settlements emerged. The most enduring legacy of this era, Stonehenge, a mysterious monument that still captivates us today, standing as a testament to the ingenuity of England's prehistoric people. By the Bronze Age, around 2000 BC, metalworking had arrived, bringing with it trade networks that stretched across Europe. Yet the greatest cultural shift came with the Celts, a warrior society that dominated much of Western Europe by 500 BC. They brought iron, intricate art, and a tribal way of life that would persist until Rome's legions marched ashore. In 55 BC, the legendary Roman general Julius Caesar launched an exploratory invasion of Britain. But it wasn't until 43 AD that Emperor Claudius ordered a full-scale conquest. The Romans advanced relentlessly, crushing Celtic resistance, most famously Boudicca's revolt in 60 AD, where the warrior queen's rebellion ended in a fiery, doomed last stand. For nearly 4 centuries, England, then called Britannia, was a Roman province. The invaders built roads, forts, and cities. London, Londinium, York, Iberacum, and Bath, Aquae Sulis, became thriving hubs of trade and governance. Hadrian's Wall, stretching across northern England, marked the empire's northernmost frontier, a symbol of both power and limitation. Yet Rome's grip weakened as barbarian invasions and internal strife plagued the empire. By 410 AD, the last legions withdrew, leaving Britannia vulnerable to a new wave of invaders, ones who would reshape the land forever. With Rome gone, Britain fractured into warring Celtic kingdoms. But from across the North Sea came a new force, the Anglo-Saxons, Germanic tribes from modern-day Denmark and northern Germany. Historians debate whether their arrival was a violent conquest or a gradual migration, but by the 6th century, the Anglo-Saxons dominated eastern Britain. They pushed the native Britons into Wales and Cornwall, replacing Latin and Celtic tongues with Old English, the ancestor of the language we speak today. By 600 AD, England was a patchwork of rival kingdoms: Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia, each vying for dominance. Christianity, reintroduced by missionaries like St. Augustine, slowly replaced pagan beliefs, uniting the land under a new spiritual order. Yet just as England began to coalesce, a new terror arrived from the sea. In 793 AD, Viking longships descended upon the monastery of Lindisfarne, slaughtering monks and plundering sacred treasures. This marked the beginning of the Viking Age, a time of relentless raids that would escalate into full-scale invasion. In 865 AD, the Great Heathen Army A massive Viking force landed in East Anglia, conquering kingdom after kingdom. Only Wessex, under King Alfred the Great, held out. After a desperate guerrilla war, Alfred defeated the Vikings at Edington, 878 AD, and secured a fragile peace, dividing England between Saxon rule and the Viking-controlled Danelaw. Alfred's successors, particularly his grandson Ethelstan, completed the reconquest, unifying England under one crown in 927 AD. But Viking threats lingered, culminating in 1016 AD, when Knut the Great, a Danish king, seized the throne, ruling a North Sea empire that stretched from England to Scandinavia. England's independence was restored under Edward the Confessor, 1042 to 1066, but his death without an heir would trigger the most famous invasion in English history. The world of Anglo-Saxon England was gone. Norman lords seized lands, French became the language of the elite, and castles like the Tower of London rose as symbols of foreign rule. Yet from this upheaval, a stronger, more centralized England would emerge, one that would eventually forge its own destiny. William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings was just the beginning. The Anglo-Saxon nobility was systematically replaced by Norman lords, who built stone castles, like the Tower of London, to dominate the land. Resistance was crushed mercilessly, most famously in the Harrying of the North, 1069 to 70, where William burned villages and starved thousands into submission. To consolidate power, William commissioned the Domesday Book, 1086, a vast survey of England's wealth. It was both a taxation tool and a symbol of Norman efficiency. Yet despite their grip, the Normans never fully erased Anglo-Saxon culture. Instead, a fusion emerged. Old English blended with Norman French, creating the foundation of Middle English. William's successors, particularly Henry I, 1100 to 1135, strengthened royal authority, but his death without a male heir sparked a 19-year civil war between his daughter, Empress Matilda, and nephew Stephen of Blois. The conflict, known as the Anarchy, 1135 to 1154, left England in ruins until a compromise crowned Matilda's son, Henry II, in 1154, ushering in the Plantagenet dynasty. Henry II was one of England's most formidable kings. Through marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, he ruled an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. But his reign was defined by legal reforms, establishing royal courts and common law, which still underpin England's justice system today. Yet Henry's greatest failure was family. His sons, Richard the Lionheart and John, rebelled against him, and his feud with Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, ended in Becket's murder in Canterbury Cathedral, 1170, a scandal that shook Christendom. Richard I, 1189 to 1199, spent most of his reign fighting crusades, leaving England bankrupt. His brother John, 1199 to 1216, fared worse, losing Normandy to France and facing baronial revolt. In 1215, the furious nobles forced him to sign Magna Carta, a document limiting royal power and establishing the principle that even the king was not above the law. Though John soon ignored it, Magna Carta became a cornerstone of constitutional monarchy. John's son, Henry III, 1216 to 1272, struggled with rebellious barons led by Simon de Montfort, who in 1265 summoned the first parliament, including commoners, a radical step toward representative government. But England's true expansion came under Edward I, 1272 to 1307, the Hammer of the Scots. He conquered Wales, building castles like Caernarfon, and tried to subdue Scotland, executing rebel William Wallace in 1305. Yet his wars drained England's treasury, and Scotland remained unconquered. Meanwhile, England's economy grew through wool trade, laying the groundwork for future prosperity. The 14th century was a time of catastrophe and transformation. The Hundred Years' War, 1337 to 1453. Edward III claimed the French throne, leading to epic battles like Crécy, 1346, and Poitiers, 1356, where English longbowmen slaughtered French knights. But the war became a costly stalemate. The Black Death, 1348 to 50. The plague wiped out half of England's population, causing labor shortages and peasant demands for better wages. The Peasants' Revolt, 1381. Enraged by poll taxes, rebels led by Wat Tyler stormed London, beheading officials before being crushed. Though failed, it showed feudalism was dying. Meanwhile, Geoffrey Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales in Middle English, signaling the decline of French as the elite's language. The 15th century saw England tear itself apart in a dynastic bloodbath. Henry IV, 1399 to 1413, seized the throne from Richard II, but his Lancastrian line faced rebellions. Henry V, 1413 to 1422, briefly restored glory with his victory at Agincourt, 1415. But his early death left England ruled by his infant son, Henry VI, a weak king plagued by mental illness. Civil war erupts, 1455. The rival houses of York, White Rose, and Lancaster, Red Rose, fought for control. Battles like Towton, 1461, the bloodiest on English soil, and Tewkesbury, 1471, saw kings deposed and murdered. Richard III, 1483 to 85. The last Yorkist king, accused of killing his nephews, the princes in the Tower, was defeated by Henry Tudor at Bosworth Field, 1485. With Henry's marriage to Elizabeth of York, the war ended and the Tudor dynasty began. Medieval England was a land of violence and innovation, from Magna Carta to Parliament, from peasant revolts to the birth of English literature. This era laid the foundations of modern Britain. When Henry Tudor seized the crown at Bosworth Field in 1485, England was still reeling from decades of civil war. The Wars of the Roses had left the nobility decimated and the monarchy weak. Henry VII, a shrewd and calculating ruler, spent his reign consolidating power, filling the royal coffers and securing his dynasty through strategic marriages. His son, Henry VIII, would inherit a stable kingdom, and then proceed to shatter its religious foundations. Henry VIII's break with Rome in the 1530s was not merely a political maneuver, it was a cultural earthquake. The dissolution of the monasteries redistributed vast church lands to the aristocracy, creating a new class of loyal landowners. The Act of Supremacy, 1534, declared the king, not the Pope, the head of the Church of England, setting the stage for a Protestant identity that would define the nation for centuries. Yet Henry's Reformation was as much about power as piety. His desperate quest for a male heir led to the execution of 2 wives and a religious upheaval that would plunge England into chaos after his death. The short reign of Edward VI saw Protestantism entrenched, but his half-sister Mary I's brutal attempts to restore Catholicism earned her the infamous nickname Bloody Mary. By the time Elizabeth II took the throne in 1558, England was a nation deeply divided. Her compromise, a Protestant state with Catholic toleration, proved masterful. Under her rule, England defeated the Spanish Armada, 1588, establishing itself as a naval power. The Elizabethan era also birthed a cultural renaissance, with Shakespeare's plays and the voyages of explorers like Francis Drake laying the foundations for England's future empire. Yet Elizabeth's refusal to marry meant the Tudor line would end with her. In 1603, the crown passed to James VI of Scotland, uniting the two kingdoms under a single monarch, though not yet a single state. James I's reign was marked by intellectual ambition. He commissioned the King James Bible, but also by growing tensions between Crown and Parliament. His son, Charles I, inherited these conflicts and exacerbated them. Believing in the divine right of kings, Charles ruled for 11 years without Parliament, imposing unpopular taxes and religious reforms. By 1642, England was at war with itself. The English Civil War, 1642 to 1651, was not just a power struggle, it was a battle over the very nature of government. The parliamentarians, led by Oliver Cromwell, defeated the royalists, and in 1649, Charles I was executed, an unthinkable act that sent shockwaves across Europe. Cromwell's subsequent rule as Lord Protector was austere and authoritarian, enforcing Puritan morality with an iron fist. Yet his death in 1658 left a power vacuum, and by 1660 the monarchy was restored under Charles II. The so-called Merry Monarch brought back theatre and luxury, but his reign was also marked by plague, 1665, and the Great Fire of London, 1666. His brother James II proved even more controversial. A Catholic in a Protestant nation, James's attempts to impose absolutist rule led to his overthrow in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. William of Orange and his wife Mary were invited to rule, but under strict conditions. The Bill of Rights, 1689, ensured Parliament's supremacy, marking the birth of constitutional monarchy. The 18th century saw England, now united with Scotland as Great Britain, emerge as a global power. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, expelled France from North America and India, while the Industrial Revolution transformed the nation's economy. Factories, steam engines, and railways turned England into the workshop of the world, but at a grim human cost. Child labor, urban slums, and brutal working conditions sparked social unrest, culminating in movements like Chartism, which demanded political reform. By the time Victoria took the throne in 1837, Britain was the world's foremost empire, ruling over a quarter of the globe. The Victorian era was one of contradictions: unprecedented wealth alongside crushing poverty, moral rigidity alongside scientific innovation. The Great Exhibition of 1851 showcased British industrial genius, while writers like Charles Dickens exposed the suffering of the poor. The empire reached its zenith, but cracks were forming. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 and the Boer Wars revealed the limits of imperial control. The two world wars would define modern Britain and hasten the end of its empire. The First World War, 1914 to 1918, decimated a generation, with battles like the Somme becoming symbols of senseless slaughter. The Second World War, 1939 to 1945, saw Britain stand alone against Nazi Germany before emerging victorious, but financially ruined. The post-war Labour government established the welfare state, including the NHS, 1948, even as the empire dissolved. India gained independence in 1947, and by the 1960s, most of Britain's colonies had followed. The late 20th century was a period of reinvention. Margaret Thatcher's free market reforms in the 1980s reshaped the economy, while Tony Blair's Cool Britannia rebranded the nation for a new millennium. Devolution gave Scotland and Wales their own parliaments, and England grappled with its place in an increasingly globalized world. From the bloody battlefields of the Middle Ages to the smokestacks of the Industrial Revolution, from the heights of empire to the challenges of modernity, England's history is one of relentless adaptation. Its language, legal system, and cultural influence endure, a testament to a small island that once ruled the waves and forever changed the world.